When you step into a collaborative environment, you're going to see who you are as an artist real fast. It's going to come real apparent. And I think that challenge will push you to make new pathways for yourself, but also what's created from those pathways being formed. And I got clay on the mind, but when something's fired in the kiln, it actually melts and fuses. So in that way, working in a community environment, you make something on your own, but it melts and fuses into everything else. And that to me is such a beautiful way to engage art because it asks you to be a better version of yourself. And that's a hard thing. Like I failed at it so many times, I don't know how many times to count, but being a better version of yourself ultimately will lead to better expression, which leads to better art.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of To Hum is Human, a podcast where we explore the transformative power of tuning into our intuition to express our passionate purpose. I'm your host, Donnabelle, and I so appreciate you listening in today because we're going to delve into the collective hum, art, ancestry, and building cultural community. I'm so excited to introduce my next guest. Jason Montgomery is a Chicano indigenous poet, visual artist, and community cultural organizer whose work is a bold fusion of memory, myth, and social practice. Jason is the founder of 50 Arrow Gallery, a vibrant BIPOC-led community art space in Western Massachusetts. He is the co-founder of Attack Bear Press, and he served as the Poet Laureate of East Hampton from 2021 to 2023. Jason brings ancestral wisdom, post-colonial critique, and political urgency into every aspect of his creative work. He reimagines community through the lenses of Chicano indigenous identity, cultural hybridization, and collective liberation. From organizing the Holyoke community Ofrenda to co-founding the abolitionist group A Knee Is Not Enough, Jason works and invites us to build future shaped by memory, resistance, and belonging. Whether you're an artist, organizer, or simply navigating your own inner landscape, this conversation invites you to tune into the intuitive undercurrents that carry us home. Welcome, Jason.
Hello, thank you. Hola, Hauka, hello. I'm Jason Montgomery. It is a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for the invitation. And I love the background. I can see all of this beautiful art in the background, and the neon is gorgeous. Great way to start the morning.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, most people won't be able to see it, so they'll have to just take your word for it.
They will imagine a colorful wall behind you filled with your favorite things. And there you go.
Jason, you describe yourself as a Chicano of indigenous Californian Mexican descent.
Yep.
Can you bring us into the origin story of how your cultural identity began shaping your creative voice?
So it's a complicated question because I come from a mixed family from a lot of different cultures. There's Cape Verdean, you know, indigenous Californian, the Chumash and the Kumeyaay, the Tepehan down in Mexico, and all of these elements have played into crafting an environment in which you threw this little weird kid with neurodivergency and you end up with a very complicated question that feels like it's constantly being asked again and again and again, which is where do I fit? Where do I fit in any one of these categories? And for me, the exploration of that question led to the realization that the question in and of itself is false. Like it's starting from a false place. It's starting from a very colonial narrative around how we differentiate ourselves in culture and how we differentiate ourselves from one another. And so that realization kind of has led me to a place of trying to craft my artistic practice and my personal practices around a place that's not about negating, but about embracing. And so at times that embracing focuses on specific aspects of a familial heritage. Like my grandfather was Chicano, my grandfather, Henry, he worked with the Chicano caucus of California because he was in politics. And I was brought up very much as his grandson that I think in some ways he didn't understand but always really loved. And so he tried to guide me the best he could, but that came from a very specific cultural perspective. I remember distinctly growing up, sitting around the kitchen table with my grandfather, being told about like why you always wash your hands before you come to the table. And it's not just because it's the hygienic thing to do, it's because the Anglo is watching you. And if they think you're dirty, then you're already at a disadvantage in that conversation. All the while, I'm like, my dad's name is Donald Montgomery, sir. This is a concept that's very complicated for me.
Mm,
I'm sick.
mm. I mean, those are very intense perceptive frameworks to put on a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
And when you're already just trying to navigate what it means to be a kid
Yeah.
in society. Now, was there a moment early on when you realized that art, whether visual or written, was a way to speak to that deeper sense?
I want to say my embracing of art did not happen until my 20s, really. Art as a young child was always seen as an extra. It was a thing that only happened when all of the work was done. Personally, I think that that's a very West Coast mentality around things. The need to be productive. It's a very capitalistic mentality, but I think there's something to that idea that I came from people for whom everyone had to work just to survive.
Mm,
And art didn't have a big space in that, but it did have a space. Growing up, I remember my grandmother's embroidered aprons and the other handicrafts that they would make, and how my great grandmother, my grandmother Gomez, who I may refer to as just grandmother, just in general, she would sit and do the needlework. And then my mother's mother hated it, absolutely despised it, hated
mm,
everything about it.
mm,
Hated the needlework, and it was this strange kind of moment for me being very young and realizing there was this kind of place that that generation was in, particularly around arts and particularly around indigenous arts, where there was a desire to reject them in a way in favor of the homogenization and the incorporation into the American dynamic. And so it wasn't until my 20s really that I was I just in a strange way, I had a workplace accident and had gone back to school because of it, and had taken his name is Carl Sherlock. So Carl, if you hear this, I know you're out there, you're alive, I love you. He was my first ever art teacher, like my first ever proper art teacher, and he taught a class called From Page to Stage, adapting plays for theater, or adapting novels for theater. But what it really turned into was writing 10-minute plays. And I fell in love with it, fell in love with the art of it, the writing, the creation, every part of that. And I think personally, why I lean so much to multidisciplinary work is because my first taste was the theater, and everything happens in the theater. There's every aspect of art happening in the theater at once. And so, really, I wrote a play. It was called Green. It was a loose story telling of an experience I had with my uncle, who was a Vietnam veteran, and his post traumatic stress. It got picked up and it was done by, I think, the Actors Alliance in San Diego was the
mm,
first place it was performed. And so I got really lucky. And if I say nothing else to anyone in this world, it's people get lucky all the time for no other reason than they get lucky. And you just keep doing the thing until your luck happens. My luck
mm.
just happened to happen. I had a play, I put it out, people were like, "Oh, this is great." And that kind of started me rolling.
Wow.
Um, I did theater for a bunch of years after that. I went to grad school at UCSB to study with Naomi Azuka, the playwright, and then later with Carlos Morton, who wrote Brown Baby. And
Mm,
then I did study and do some work with the archive there for Luis Valdez and the Teatro Campesino. It was this moment for me discovering the work of Valdez, which I had found earlier on in my journey of how political and how community building art could really be. For me, and don't get me wrong, Valdez is problematic for a bunch of reasons. For me, it was just eye opening. And what was weird for me personally was starting to see the names of the activists and organizers that had populated my grandfather's universe in the art world, and having this moment of being like, crap, Dolores that they're talking about is Dolores Huerta. That's who they're talking about. They're talking about Dolores. For a young and tragically undereducated kid at that point, like, it was mind boggling to
Mm.
think that, oh my God, this can be a part of art. Like, this can be a part of art in a real, tangible way that has direct community action.
Well, what a bridge. What a beautiful bridge to connect those two parts of you that you were negotiating yourself, right? And
Yeah.
so here it presents itself. And it's fascinating that theater, which to me is a place to create a space. And in that space, you can be whatever you want. There
Yeah.
is no boundary, there's no border or rule. And it's a creative playground. And it's just fascinating to hear your path to that discovery. I'm going to go to your visual art and we'll
Yeah.
go back and forth between your writing and your visual art. So, your visual art,
Yes.
I'm curious when you started to then go from words to
So
actual images.
I both thank and blame my children's mother, Jessica Glavinich, who is a studio painter, trained studio painter, excellent painter. But really, they were doing their training at the same time that I was in school. So they were in school, I was in school. So I was fiddling with some things in visual arts at that point. I remember they had some classroom assignment, like take a bar of soap and make a piece of art out of it. And so I tracked down their professor's address, which I don't recommend doing any of this, by the way. This was definitely young, dumb Jason. I tracked down their professor's address and mailed them the bar of soap. That was kind of my first taste into, oh, art can be like visual, it can be nonsense, it can be this other world. And so if the seeds were planted at that point, they didn't really grow and blossom
Mhm.
until Attack Bear Press got founded with Alex
Mhm.
Woolner. And I can't say enough about how Alex Woolner really facilitated a place of play and of creation and of we're doing a street thing. Let's see how we can make a visual arts aspect of it. We're doing this thing over here. How can we need a poet for it? And so that kind of place of play really started me thinking, what can I do visually and what can I do around creation of space in a visual aesthetic? And so that started being really what I've focused on, is these installations that have visual aspects to them, but are really designed to create a space in whatever place they occupy.
Mm. I want to go back to the soap because what
Yeah.
happened after you sent them the soap?
Oh, well, so I met up with my kid's mother at that point, and they were like, they think you either are crazy or genius, and they can't decide which. And they were shocked that, because I didn't even bother wrapping it. I just threw a stamp on it, wrote in Sharpie, and put it in the mail, and shipped it off, and it got there. All things considered, it was, I think, a win in the win column, but it definitely got me a name in the art department at that point. And we were at Cal State San Marcos at this
Mhm.
point. So it was a very
Mhm.
small campus. But that also, I think, played into it because it was such a small campus and such a small area that there was a lot of communication happening and
Mm.
a lot of play happening.
I mean,
Yeah.
if anything, it sort of took everyone out of their typical routine. You're like, what
Hmm.
is this? And I think
Yeah.
that act in itself is such a powerful tool
Yeah.
in different ways to kind of reframe and rethink how we go about our day, how
Yeah.
we go about what creativity means. And it's interesting that you took from writing and creating a play to creating something tactile. You had something in your hand. And then what do you do with that? It's such a fascinating story, and we could probably talk about that for a while. But I want to talk about your art, your visual art at this time. And so in your work, you fuse Chicano and indigenous art
Mhm.
traditions with movements like Cubism and
Yeah.
Russian abstraction. And I was wondering what draws you to these intersections, and then how do they speak to your own inner landscapes?
I'm drawn to them because as I learned more about art and about history and about these movements that came before it, I realized, I think, in a very practical way, because in some ways I am still very much the son of blue collar people and will always be that. It was like, okay, well, the practicality of some of these aesthetics allows me to work in a way that I don't have to stretch limited resources. That may sound a little weird. I'm drawn to what's happening in the Russians based on literally one artist I found whose name is completely escaping me right now, who paints with coffee grounds to add texture to his paint. He incorporates coffee grounds into them, and it makes this beautiful, almost dirt texture. And I had this moment where I was like, oh my God, what are they doing over there? And like got into this and was realizing some of this was purely out of need.
Mm,
How can I stretch my paint further? Some of it was the embracing of things that had come before them. With the cubist, I'm very interested in how dimension plays with aesthetic, and how perspective plays with aesthetic, and how context plays with aesthetic.
mm,
And so you'll see a lot of my work does tend to ask you to move around it to fully understand what's happening, and ask you to read and move through it to fully understand what's happening.
mm.
And that, for me, like a lot of what I do tends to be instinctual as I'm working. So it's a lot of think, huge burst of work. And then I lay fallow for like 6 months where I'm thinking, I'm reading. I'm right now, I'm working on a project that's been going for a while, a visual project called The Death of Lake Kaliwa. And The Death of Lake Kaliwa's had a couple installations at this point. Its most recent installation is going to be a part of the Wild Clay Weekend at Union Arts in New Paltz, New York, somewhere in upstate. And what I had been doing with that was working with clay specifically sourced from the Salton Sea, which traditionally was Lake Kaliwa, and processing that clay. So it's been a whole new just learning about how do I throw? How do I create this? And there's not, unfortunately, a lot of traditional indigenous knowledge left in the area around potting. And I can go into why that is.
Mm.
There are some amazing potters out there doing some amazing work. Don't get me wrong. Google them and find them. Just off the top of my head, and he's not Kaliwa, but his name is Tony Soares. If you get a chance to look at Tony Soares' work, he's doing some beautiful traditional work, and he's put in the work to learn it. I'm not necessarily looking to replicate indigenous aesthetics with this particular show, because what it really is about is the dirt itself. It's about what's happening, the process that's going on out there with the evaporation of the Salton Sea.
Mm.
All of this is to say, in a long, long way, being drawn to stuff that I get to do with my hands, I think scratches a very particular itch with my ADD.
It's funny that you were like so drawn to the coffee grounds and the way that you kind of smear that onto the canvas. That's a very tactile and also very visual experience. But then now you're incorporating place
Yeah.
into your work. And that's just another layer. Like the cubism, you're adding so many multi-dimensional layers within your work. And it's just a beautiful transformation as you're working through these periods essentially in your creative process. Now, you've used the phrases sacred messes and
Mm,
punk
yeah.
spirituality. These are evocative, also layered terms. Can you
Yeah.
unpack what these mean to you and how they show up in your creative and community practice?
So sacred messes are, I think, at the heart of what I do. When I step into, for lack of a better term, the art space, whatever that space is at that particular moment, there's a transformation happening, and there's a sacredness to that transformation. You're turning these abstract elements into something else, and something that's imbued with meaning, and that will be imbued with meaning outside of the context of you. That is such a a incredible piece of magic that we do as people.
Hmm.
It's a mess because it's and And bless all the artists for whom they step into their art space and they're like, I have a plan, I have a process, have these steps that will arrive at this particular thing. That is not how I work. It is thrown together. There's times where I'm throwing paint from across the room just to get a mess on the canvas.
Mm.
When it's in a community space, that may be more abstract. It's the mess of having as many people at the table as we can, all shouting over each other and talking at the same time and working on the same things. With the community ofrenda, this is a piece of art that we leave on the street for 72 hours and invite people to add to subtract from, to put their loved ones onto the altar and to bring their loved ones into that space. And that is as sacred as I think it gets. And it's a mess because we don't know what they're going to do.
Well, if you could, for our listeners, tell us what an ofrenda is.
So, an ofrenda is an offering made during the Dia de los Muertos holidays, plural. It typically is made upon an altar that's constructed. People often construct these at their home. They'll construct them at cemeteries. And I'm going to paraphrase a lot and skip over a lot just to condense for science purposes. It is the continuation of a indigenous practice that has taken place in parts of Mexico for thousands of years,
Mm.
in which the spirits return from the afterlife, the underworld, in a very literal fashion. They return, they're guided home by this offering, and this offering is what you make to them. It's made up of food, it's made up of water, particularly salt, because in this particular spirituality, the spirits can't eat or drink or sustain themselves. And so this is their meal for the year. You have their favorite things to let them know that you are still thinking of them. I like talking about the ofrenda because even the ofrenda is complicated and
Mhm.
in some ways incredibly problematic. And, when you look at it from the Chicano perspective, if we go back to perspective, the first kind of large community ofrenda or official community ofrenda was like 1978 in a cemetery in Berkeley. And it was part of a larger festival happening around Chicano rights.
Mm.
And so it was very much this community event that, for lack of a better term, appropriated a spirituality that only tangentially belonged to the people that were there. It gets even more hilarious when you realize that later, these same Chicanos, these same groups of people, headed down to Mexico City in student exchanges and brought this practice with them to a population that largely were like, no, they do that out in the hills, man. That's
Uh,
that's like country stuff. Like, we don't
mm.
do that here.
Hmm.
But then they started practicing it. So you can see how things get wonky real fast.
Mhm.
And it can all be beautifully summed up in a. Do you remember the James Bond film where James Bond is on a motorcycle going through a Day of the Dead celebration in Mexico City?
Oh gosh.
It happened. It was one of the newer Bond films.
Mhm.
Funny thing is that parade never actually took place in Mexico City. They never had like a large scale city celebration.
Hmm.
And they literally end up buying the props from the movie because, like, the Mexico City Tourism Board's like, "Oh, we can make money doing."
Oh my goodness.
And so all this
Yeah.
stuff you see, particularly around Mexico City, can all be kind of tied back to a group of Chicanos appropriating this practice. And so
Mm,
when we start talking about things, it gets messy
mm,
real fast. And
mm,
I would encourage people, particularly now,
mhm,
to embrace the mess. Embrace the mess. Because right now, the deconstruction of that mess into its component parts and the radicalization of each of those parts is such a huge part of what's going on with our culture.
mhm.
So that's my soapbox.
I appreciate that, and it's a fascinating take on what it means to have a community offering
Yeah.
and when it's tied to so many different other aspects of its creation, because I know several cultures have this Day of the
Yep.
Dead. I mean, and in the Philippines, they go to the cemeteries and have feasts at the
Yep.
cemetery. Like, that is their way. They don't do an ofrenda necessarily, but they go to the cemetery. So everyone has a way of honoring their dead. But
Yep.
when you bring it into the community and leave it open to
Yep.
interpretation That's where the beauty is, because when you have no rules, then people feel included because
Yeah.
they can just participate. And I think that, in essence, is what I love about your ofrenda. Now,
Yeah.
you say punk spirituality. Is
Yeah.
that also tied to this as well?
Yeah, I think so. Is Pat the Bunny, like a punk rock song will never save the world, but I can tell you a couple that saved me. I take that to heart. There's something about the DIY aspect of the punk rock world, the rejection of the need for success that's tied to specific definitions of capitalist visions of what your life should be. It's about self-definition. And in some ways, my spirituality is tied to that. It's tied to this creation of something new, and it can be created internally and it can be created by oneself, and like at some point things take on a life of their own, and it ties back to that first thing. Like I remember it was this year I was hanging out at the ofrenda one night just chilling as you do, and this kid on a bicycle rode up to me with his little friends, and they were like, yeah, you see this? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, yeah, we do this every year in this neighborhood. And he was so proud of the ofrenda, and I was like, this isn't mine anymore. This belongs to this neighborhood. That idea of saying the success of this thing is not that it has Jason Montgomery's name plastered all over it. The success of this thing is that kid.
Well, I was going to say, because your creativity doesn't just come from your singular works. You've co-founded initiatives like Attack Bear Press, A Knee Is Not Enough, and obviously the Holyoke Community Ofrenda. What does this collective art making or cultural organizing offer that solitary practice doesn't?
I think it offers challenge first and foremost. When you step in, and I think this comes back to the early work in theater, when you step into a collaborative environment, you're going to see who you are as an artist real fast.
Mm.
It's going to come real apparent. And like, I think that challenge will push you to make new pathways for yourself, but also what's created from those pathways being formed. Like, and I got clay on the mind, don't to blame me, but when something's fired in the kiln, it actually melts
Mm.
and fuses. In that way, working in a community environment, you make something on your own, but it melts and fuses into everything else. That to me is such a beautiful way to engage art, because it asks you to be a better version of yourself. And that's a hard thing. I failed at it so many times, I don't know how many times to count. But being a better version of yourself ultimately will lead to better expression, which
Mhm.
leads to better art.
Yeah, and more collective
Yeah.
consciousness building, I think.
Yeah.
You co-founded 50 Arrow Gallery in the Eastworks building in East Hampton. And what does that look like to you, both practically and energetically, to make a physical space both as a sanctuary and a site for challenging conversations?
My favorite piece of art I've ever done is 50 Arrow Gallery, because it's such a weird artistic expression in that it is a space that really is designed for Black, Indigenous, and other persons of color artists to come in and to have the freedom to play and to embrace this space. And I can draw an abundance of energy from that. There's nothing like stepping into a space and seeing the joy happening on another artist's face as they are playing with their practice and saying like, I brought the canvas for that. I brought the space for that. That is such a beautiful thing. The challenging conversations is where things get tough, because it's not just about having the conversation in of itself. It's about the energy that it takes to facilitate a space where that conversation can truly happen.
Uh-huh.
And in some ways, one of my regrets around the gallery is that we're not having enough of those conversations. And some of that is us, and some of that is our audience, and some of that is how we're meeting our audience and how they're meeting us. But having a challenging conversation takes all that energy and all that beauty and really test it. Uh,
Mhm.
and I think that if I have a message for everyone, particularly right now around this, is it's give yourself the grace to fail in those conversations and have them again. and come back to the table and have that conversation again and keep having it until there's headway. Yeah,
Well, it's a process. It's not something there's not going to be a magic solution after one discussion. It's
yeah.
the understanding that it's a very complicated world where we all have various perspectives, and each perspective has validity because that is where you are coming from. And
Mhm.
the notion of one idea is more valued than the other is deep and it's
Yeah,
complicated. And I'm sure there people wrestle with it. And I think there's a beautiful honoring of
yeah.
that dialogue. And you create that at the gallery.
And we're trying, and specifically this year, we had the benefit of going through New England Foundation of the Arts Spatial Justice for Imagining's grant process. And one of the things that gave us the space to do was to step back and actually imagine what we would want for this space. And a couple things came out of that imagining. For me personally, that realization and solidification of the belief that there are communities, plural. It's a plurality. And providing access means negotiating all of these communities. And that in and of itself, as we had been talking about community, 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 we imagined a homogenous whole. And again, it's that colonial thinking that pops up when you least expect it.
Mhm.
And so, yeah. And one of the other things, and I mean, I don't mind talking about it now, is I decided to take a step back from the executive director's role and let Naya Gabriel from Creative Resilience Lab step into that. Didn't let anyone do anything, but they're stepping into that position to guide the gallery into its next framework.
Mhm.
And I'm going to be in the background doing fundraising work, managing the represented collection for the gallery. But really, that idea of saying this can't be the Jason show, and it's turning into the Jason show. And I don't want it to be. I don't think this is what the space needs. And so, yeah, that felt really good, and it's freed up space to say, okay, what's now? What happens now?
Well, and also too, your model is shifting as
Yeah,
well. You've
yeah,
also added more of an incubator space. Can you
yep.
tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we realized through this kind of weird happenstance, we met with Yago and Hitomi. Hitomi is the owner of Hashi Pottery Plus, which is a small business that's dedicated to Japanese pottery in all of its kind of beautiful kaleidoscope. And so Hashi curates a collection, and that curation they were selling. I think they were at a little boutique. They had a shelf at a boutique and a website when we met them. And we were like, okay, well, what could you do if I were to clear up this corner of the gallery space and you're there operating essentially a storefront? And so they took it and ran with it. And we realized as we were kind of doing this thing, we are like, oh my God, we're incubating a business. That's
Mhm.
what we're doing here. They're
Mhm.
getting capital. We did a work exchange where they gallery sat in exchange for the space, and we watched their sales go up. We watched their business solidify and expand, and we're like, okay, well, what's the next logical step to an incubation? And that's going from hatching to hatchling. And
Mhm.
so the hatchling was expanding into our secondary gallery space for what would be a traditional show in our space. And so they're in that space, they're showing, they follow the same model that we've been following with everyone, with the caveat that we based the business incubation on the amount of capital that they can raise versus a time frame. So the
Mhm.
idea really is, okay, if you can raise your capital limit in 8 weeks, rockin', you're out of here, man. See you later. It's been
Mhm.
great. Take that capital, invest in your business. If
Mhm.
it takes you longer, rockin'. We're happy
Mhm.
to have you here. Let's get
Mhm.
you to that magic number so that you can leave the nest.
Mm.
So that pathway to expanding what the gallery does has allowed us to now say, okay, the gallery now is incubating businesses. We're representing artists. We're having exhibition shows. There's a lot happening here in this
Yeah, it's
little
very
space in
fertile.
Eastworks.
Yes,
Yeah.
and another facet where you can now focus on your own work too. I
Yeah.
feel like that's also the trajectory that is needed, and it's been going for 6 years.
Yeah.
And if you could just tell us briefly about how you got the name 50 Arrow Gallery.
Okay, so 50 Arrow Gallery, It was Alex and I. And again, I cannot begin to tell you, like, I think a lot of people see me out in the world and they're like, wow, how does Jason do it? Because there's a whole other person.
Yeah.
Like, there's this whole other person doing all of this work named Alex Wilner, and you should thank them. And people are like, yeah, but how do you do it? I'm like, you're not listening. 50 year, we're sitting there and we're racking our brains trying to think of what to call this space, because the space got created when Simone Sampler over at Eastworks was like, Attack Bear Press needs a place to operate during the pandemic, ahead of the pandemic. And where would that be? We were like, okay, well, we don't know. We're closing our studio in Holyoke, blah, blah, blah. They're like, move here and you can move into Eastworks. We got 1,000 square feet for you. We're like, great. We cut a deal. Everything was awesome. And then we walked in the space and we're like, 1,000 square feet is way too much space for us. So we built some walls and we're like, we're going to do a gallery. We're going to do a gallery. And this gallery space is going to be free to use. It's not going to say no to anything. It's going to be all of these incredible things. And we get through all the process of doing this. And literally, we were going to be opening for Eastworks Open Studios, which 3,000 people come through. And we're like, we don't have a name for this place. So we're standing there in the middle of the night and I'm standing below an I-beam and Alex is like, well, what about 50 Arrow? And I was like, I really like 50 Arrow. That's a great name. Where'd you get that from? And Alex is like, look up. And I looked up and on the I-beam, they had painted, there was the number 50 with an arrow pointing that direction. And so we were like, 50 Arrow, that's it. And so it kind of rolled from there. And our first show was of Native American artist. And so I'm sitting there and I'm having this moment of like, yeah, talking to somebody, and they're like, yeah, oh, it's 50 Arrow. And I know the story of the 50 arrows. And he goes and he tells me this story, which and I say this not to be mean, but he's a white dude. So I take this as being fully crap. And he's like, yeah, so that's where you guys got your name from. And I was like, actually, we got it from the I-beam right over there.
The story is pretty amazing.
Yeah. And
And
so
it's stuck ever since.
yeah, and
I
it's
love
stuck
that
ever
story
since.
because there is this sort of element of luck. You're
Yeah.
saying earlier that things just fall into your path, and I feel like for myself there are no coincidences.
Yeah.
There are things just placed there, and it just being aware of them is part of the journey. Now, you served as the East Hampton Poet Laureate from
Yes.
21 to 23,
Mhm.
and your poetry tackles heavy themes like fierce honesty, recovery, parenthood, obviously cultural identity. How does intuition guide you through vulnerability and risk in your writing?
Particularly with my writing, it's all intuition because my writing tends to start with an undefined feeling that pops up on me out of nowhere. And that I'll usually sit down and try to futz my way through and try to understand, what is this feeling? What's happening here? And then trying to take that process and put it down on the page and figure out how do I talk about this to myself? Because I'm always my first audience member. And in some ways, that takes on a very loose, at least technically, a very loose framework. I tend when I write either completely in form. I love writing a nonet. It's a very small poem that starts with 9 syllables and works its way down to one,
Thank you.
because writing in that form really allows me to figure the puzzle out. But the other aspect of it is this real free form. I'm just putting things down and then carving it around and moving things and shaping things and trying to feel my way through what this is. And I think that has a tendency to be very different from other writers who tend to think way, way about what does this look like and read like. I'm like, what does this really feel like to read this moment? And I had a conversation at one point about a poet who had said something along the lines of, here you attribute a metaphor to sight that's really about smell. And I remember looking over and I was like, do you know what it feels like to see a smell? And the guy was like, no. And I'm like, well, come back to me when you do, because I've seen some smells in my life. I worked years ago as a pump mechanic, because I've done all the things. I worked as a pump mechanic for a dewatering company
Mm.
and got lowered into a old cess tank,
Oh,
old
goodness.
cesspool tank to drop a pump. I saw that smell from a mile away,
Yeah.
and I can still feel that smell in the deepest parts.
Yeah, it's a very physical
Yeah.
pres
And so I think like that's how I try to tackle poetry.
Mm,
And so, yeah.
that's well said, well said.
Thank you.
So, Jason, what does belonging mean to you now, and how has that meaning changed over time?
That is a good question because the trajectory of my life has been very much as an outsider for most of it. Belonging now is very internal. I belong wherever I'm at, and you can't tell me different because there has been too much that has happened throughout my life that has gotten me right here. And so I belong here, and we belong in conversation, and we belong in community together. That part of me, though, is always going to be struggling, I think, with this feeling of being outside. And so part of, I think, even the drive to create community is to kind of address that feeling of wanting to belong with people
Mm,
and wanting to belong. But I think that's a much younger version of myself. But that much younger version of myself is always there.
I think that's such a beautiful way of understanding your place in the world because place is really not a location. It's
No.
really about a sense of being
Yeah.
wherever you are.
Yeah.
That comes from wisdom and age, I have to say too. Although
Yeah. I think,
some people get there sooner, sure.
yeah. And I think there's for me too, and I don't it's wisdom and it's age, and I hope that people understand that at some point I looked back and I looked at not just all of the things that led to my life, but all of the things that led to my ancestors' lives and all of these things, all of that tidal wave of humanity led to me sitting and talking and being. And if you can't honor that, something's wrong. So
Mm,
honor that.
yeah. Well, Jason Montgomery, thank you so much for sharing your voice, your vision, your vibrant commitment to cultural community. I think that
Thank
is
you.
a true gift because it brings collective transformation. Whether you're just viewing or participating, there's something there to be
Yeah.
learned and shared. And it's just like your bridge to connecting your ancestry with your creative part of you. It's really a bridge between worlds of understanding. And
Thank you.
I just love how your work invites us to reimagine how we belong to each other, to place, and to possibility.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thanks for being here. I hope something from today's conversation stayed with you or gave you a new way to look at things. That awareness, that pause, that's where things start to shift. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who might need it. You can learn more about my work and what's coming up at sonorouslight.com, and you can follow me on Instagram at To Hum Is Human. Until next time, keep humming.